I knew she was trouble the moment she marched up my driveway in her wedge sandals, clutching that clipboard like it was a badge. Her name was Deborah. Of course it was. Deborah Lynn Whitmore, self-appointed queen of the Briarwood Pines HOA, standing 5'0" of pure entitlement. I'm Carter Ashby. I bought my place at the end of Maple Loop, last house before the woods start, quiet, private, and with a back gate that opens onto my own gravel lane. That back gate had never been an issue until the HOA got a new president. Mr. Ashby, Deborah called out, using that fake sweet tone that always means a demand is coming. That gate needs to stay locked. HOA regulations strictly prohibit secondary egress points. It's on my property, I said, not even looking up from the brake pads I was swapping on my truck. The easement predates the HOA charter by 20 years. County records confirm it. She clucked her tongue. We'll see about that. I already had, twice, with a property attorney, but Deborah didn't care about facts, just control. Things escalated fast after that. Fines started showing up in my mailbox. First $50, then $150, all for non-compliant access structures. I ignored them. They had no legal standing. I filed a dispute with the county, and sure enough, the HOA had no authority over that part of my lot. But Deborah wasn't used to losing. Last Thursday, I came home from my overnight shift at the hospital and found her silver Lexus parked sideways across my gate. She'd literally blocked it bumper to fence post. I stood there, sweaty and tired, holding my coffee like it was the only thing keeping me from losing it. That's when she popped out from behind the hedge. "Oh, Carter," she said, all innocence. "You weren't supposed to be back until noon. HOA meeting notes said you take Fridays off. You're stalking my schedule now." She ignored that. "Until you remove the gate, I can't allow vehicle access. It's a safety violation. Children could wander back there. There are no kids on this side of the loop." "Still," she said, folding her arms like she was delivering a TED talk on property safety. I didn't argue. I walked inside, sipped my coffee, pulled up the HOA charter on my laptop, and printed off the section about boundary authority. Then I called the sheriff's non-emergency line. Deputy Harris showed up within the hour. I handed him the papers, told him the whole story, and he just shook his head. "People like her give HOAs a bad name," he muttered. Deborah came storming out of her garden when she saw the cruiser. "You can't tow my car," she shrieked before anyone said a word. "This is a private community." Deputy Harris didn't flinch. "Ma'am, you're illegally blocking a residential driveway. That's a violation of county code. You've been warned." "I'm the HOA president." He looked at her like she said she was Queen of England. "And I'm the sheriff. Move it or we'll move it for you." She refused. 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulled up. Deborah screamed like she was being robbed, literally screamed. Neighbors came out, phones came out. "Carter Ashby is violating HOA codes," she shouted as the Lexus got hitched. "He's endangering the community." No one backed her up. Not even Brenda Harper, her usual sidekick. I leaned against my fence, arms crossed, sipping my coffee as the tow truck rumbled off with her precious Lexus. Deborah glared at me like I'd personally destroyed her life. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I smiled. Doubt it, and I didn't. Not even a little, because what she didn't know. I'd just gotten my hands on something that could bring the whole HOA board down. Saturday morning brought a strange calm, the kind that settles right before a storm. I was out back with my dog, a retired K9 named Diesel, tossing a deflated soccer ball around when I noticed a white sedan idling just past the tree line behind my fence. Not unusual unless you considered that the gravel lane back there was marked private access, no through traffic. The sign had been there longer than most of the houses on Maple Loop. I walked over, wiping grease from my hands with a rag. The driver didn't move, just sat there watching. I stepped closer and recognized the guy behind the wheel. Randall Pierce, the HOA treasurer. Middle-aged, always in a blue windbreaker and always lurking at the back of meetings, pretending not to be taking notes. I'd never spoken to him directly, until now. "You lost," I asked, stopping at the gate. He flinched like I'd caught him doing something worse than trespassing. "Just checking drainage patterns," he said, voice tight. "There's been flooding on the south end. The board asked me to investigate runoff points." "Funny," I said. "That'd be Public Works' job, not yours." He didn't reply. Just rolled up his window and backed out like he couldn't get away fast enough. I waited until his car was gone, then walked inside and pulled out the folder I'd been building for 3 months. Receipts, emails, meeting transcripts, and most importantly digital copies of a wire transfer sent from the HOA Reserve Fund to a Shell LLC registered in Nevada. That LLC, owned by Randall's cousin. It was listed as a landscaping contractor, but had no employees and no visible equipment. The only reason I got my hands on that transfer was because of a mistake. They'd sent me a digital invoice in error, thinking I was another homeowner named Carter Ashton, close enough for their lazy record keeping. I'd followed the trail out of curiosity, not expecting to find a funneling scheme right under the community's nose. I wasn't ready to go public yet, not until I had enough to bury the whole board. But Deborah's stunt with the Lexus had pushed the timeline forward. They weren't just overreaching, they were panicking, and panicked people make mistakes. Later that afternoon, I took a drive to City Hall, not for drama, for records. The planning department was quiet, just one clerk behind the glass, and a stack of manila folders that hadn't been digitized since the Clinton administration. I gave her the parcel number for the HOA's communal green belt. 5 minutes later, I had what I needed. A zoning change request stamped and approved 6 weeks ago had reclassified the land behind the clubhouse. It was no longer communal green space. It was now zoned for mixed-use development, which meant someone was planning to build, probably fast and probably cheap. The kicker. The request had been submitted under Randall's signature, and Deborah had co-signed it. That explained her sudden obsession with my back gate. That gravel lane, it ran parallel to the rezoned land. If someone bulldozed a few trees, they could open up an access road, a private one, which would raise the value of that land by a factor of 10. But there was a problem. My easement cut right through their proposed road, and unless I gave up that access point, they couldn't legally connect anything to it. That's why she needed the gate gone, not for safety, for profit. I left City Hall with copies of everything, filed a public records request for HOA communications tied to that zoning change. Then I stopped by the county assessor's office and flagged the parcel for potential fraud. That was step 1. Step 2 came the next morning. A man in a polo shirt and mirrored sunglasses knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Greg Vance, a community development consultant working on behalf of a client interested in revitalizing underutilized parcels. Translation: he was the developer. He tried to play it cool, complimented my lawn, asked about the soil quality, pretended not to notice Diesel watching him through the window with full police dog intensity. "Your gate's in a tricky spot," he said finally. "If someone were to offer a generous buyout for that slice of your land, would you consider it?" "Depends on the offer," I said. He quoted a number. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough to make me forget what they'd tried to pull. "Tell Deborah if she wants to negotiate, she needs to stop using tow trucks and start using lawyers." His eyebrows twitched. "I don't know who that is." "Sure you don't." He left a card anyway. I tossed it in the shredder. By Monday, things had gotten weirder. Several neighbors reported getting notices about sudden compliance updates. Fines for things like wind chimes, mailbox height, even bird feeders, all in the same handwriting, all issued without warning. Then came the cameras. I spotted them the next evening, small black domes mounted to the lampposts near the clubhouse and along the loop. No HOA vote had been held. No notice had been sent. I checked the serial numbers. They linked back to a company out of Florida that specialized in community monitoring systems. And who'd signed the invoice? Deborah. I called in a favor from a buddy who worked cyber forensics. He traced the feed. It wasn't going to a security firm. It was going to a private server registered to a P.O. box in Georgia. A P.O. box that just happened to match the mailing address of the same shell LLC Randall had wired funds to. They weren't just funneling money. They were collecting surveillance footage of residents without consent. That was enough. Early Thursday morning, I walked into the county prosecutor's office and handed over a full report: financial misappropriation, zoning fraud, illegal surveillance, and potential racketeering. I didn't go in alone. 2 other homeowners came with me. One was a retired judge. The other ran a bookkeeping business and had spotted discrepancies in the HOA budget months ago. The deputy DA didn't even blink. "You've just described a textbook RICO case," he said, flipping through the files. "We'll open an investigation immediately." By the following week, subpoenas started going out. Randall was the first to lawyer up. Deborah tried to hold a special session of the HOA to issue emergency bylaw changes, but fewer than 10 residents showed up. Half walked out once she started ranting about outside agitators. I stayed quiet, didn't gloat. Let the system do its thing. Then, just as the investigation hit full swing, something unexpected happened. A locksmith showed up at the clubhouse and changed the locks. The HOA board had been suspended under emergency provision by the county pending investigation. Deborah showed up an hour later, tried her key, and found herself locked out of her own empire. She stood there, frozen, gripping the door handle like she could will it to open. A few neighbors watched from their porches. One of them, an older guy named Tom, held up a lawn chair and asked if anyone wanted popcorn. She turned, saw me across the street, and for once didn't say a word. Didn't yell. Didn't threaten, just walked to her car and drove off. I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching the clubhouse fade behind her bumper. The gate's still there, so is the easement. But now, so is accountability. By the time the county froze the HOA's accounts, the panic had started to ripple across the neighborhood. Not from fear, no, people weren't scared. They were angry. Years of tolerated nonsense from Deborah and her board had finally cracked, and now that the curtain was pulled back, nobody was in the mood to whisper anymore. I kept my head down mostly. I wasn't interested in becoming some kind of neighborhood hero. But that changed the night I got a knock on my door from someone I never expected. Mrs. Crandall from 3 houses down. Lived there for nearly 25 years, barely spoke above a whisper, always kept to herself and her roses. She was holding a manila envelope thick enough to need 2 hands. "I think you're the only one who'll know what to do with this," she said, voice barely audible over the wind. Inside were photocopies of handwritten ledgers, HOA meeting notes, receipts that never made it into official financial reports, and a typed letter with a signature at the bottom, Randall's approving a discretionary fund for special neighborhood support expenses. "Where'd you get this?" I asked. She pulled out a small, dusty key. "I used to be on the board. Years ago, before Deborah took over, I still had the key to the records locker in the clubhouse basement. I knew they'd never think to change that one. The documents didn't just show misuse of funds. They revealed something much worse. Payments were going out, monthly large ones, to a company called Sapphire Ridge Consulting. I'd never heard of it. Neither had the county's contractor registry. But tucked next to the payment logs was a list of incident reports Deborah had compiled, all dated over the last 18 months. Each one described a homeowner as a potential disruption to community harmony. They were labeled with coded risk values R3, R5, even an R7. There was no key for what the values meant, but the pattern was clear. And every person on the list had one thing in common. They'd challenged a board decision. I ran the company name through a private investigator I knew from my time volunteering with Veteran Legal Aid. What came back made my stomach twist. Sapphire Ridge was a front. It was tied to a security consulting firm that had lost its license in 3 states for unauthorized surveillance and harassment. The kicker: their founder had once been investigated for planting evidence in civil disputes, including a case in Arizona where a homeowner was falsely accused of running an illegal Airbnb. Sounded familiar. At that point, this wasn't just mismanagement. This was organized abuse, manipulation of homeowners. Surveillance, retaliation. I called Deputy Harris again. I didn't lead with the whole file, I just gave him one name, Sapphire Ridge. His tone changed instantly. You need to bring everything you've got to the precinct, tonight. So I did. By the following morning, a task force had been assembled. What started as a county fraud issue was now a joint investigation involving the district attorney's office, local police, and a regional cybercrime unit. They suspected that the HOA board had been subcontracting Sapphire Ridge to monitor and intimidate residents who resisted their plans, possibly even staging minor violations, to justify fines and legal threats. And it went deeper. An audit of the HOA's private server revealed audio recordings, hundreds of hours of conversations pulled from those illegal cameras. The server had voice recognition software installed. Every time a resident bad-mouthed the board, the system flagged it. Deborah and Randall had been listening in on people's porches, backyards, even walking their dogs. When word got out, the neighborhood exploded. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't in the clubhouse, they still couldn't access it. So people gathered on the lawn, folding chairs and coolers in hand. Over 80 homeowners were there. And this time, it wasn't Deborah holding the clipboard. It was the county-appointed mediator, a tall woman named Natalie Ruiz with a legal background and the kind of presence that made people sit up straight without being told. She laid it out clean. The HOA board had been suspended indefinitely. All financial activity was on hold pending a full forensic audit, and criminal charges were already in motion. Then she turned to the crowd. There's one more thing you need to be aware of. Based on evidence submitted earlier this week, there's strong reason to believe that the previous board engaged in coercive tactics that may have violated both state and federal law. People didn't gasp. They didn't shout. They just nodded, because deep down they already knew. That's when Deborah showed up. She came storming up from the sidewalk, hair pulled back tight, wearing a pantsuit like she was still in control of something. Two men in plainclothes flanked her, lawyers probably, maybe crisis consultants, but the crowd didn't part for her. Nobody moved. Natalie raised her hand. "Miss Whitmore, you are not permitted to address the HOA at this time." "I have a right to speak," Deborah snapped. "No, you don't," Natalie said calmly. "You are under criminal investigation. Any statements you make here can and will be used in court." Deborah's jaw clenched so hard her neck twitched. "You people don't understand what I've done for this neighborhood," she said, turning slowly like she was addressing an audience that wasn't there. "I kept it safe, orderly. I protected your investments." Tom, the guy with the lawn chair, stood up and said, "You bugged my patio." Deborah ignored him. "You think removing me will fix everything? You think this place will run itself?" Natalie stepped forward. "This meeting is adjourned. Miss Whitmore, I suggest you leave." "Your presence is no longer welcome." Deborah didn't argue this time. She turned, walked back to her car, and drove off without another word. 2 days later, she was arrested. The charges were serious: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit surveillance without consent, and obstruction of justice. Randall was picked up the same day. His lawyer tried to cut a deal, but the DA wasn't interested in leniency. Not when the victims numbered in the dozens. The developer, Greg Vance, he vanished. Turns out he'd been operating under a false name. The real Greg Vance had died 5 years prior in a skiing accident. The man I'd spoken to was using a stolen identity, and the company he'd claimed to represent had no legitimate business filings anywhere in the state. The authorities believed he was acting as an intermediary for a real estate syndicate trying to illegally acquire land through HOA manipulation. With the board gone, the neighborhood held a special election. This time, it wasn't about who had the best landscaping or the most connections. People wanted honesty. They voted for a retired teacher, a single mom who ran a dog rescue, and Tom, who promised never to hold a meeting indoors again. As for me, I didn't run for anything. I rebuilt the gate. This time, I added a motion sensor light, not because I expected trouble but because I could. And because it was mine. Diesel still patrols the yard like a retired war hero living the good life. The mailbox still rattles in the wind. The gravel lane still winds through the trees untouched by bulldozers or shady developers. And if anyone ever asks how it all fell apart for Deborah Whitmore, I just point to the spot where her Lexus used to sit, blocking my gate. Every story has a moment it turns. That was hers. 2 weeks after the arrests, the neighborhood felt like it had been let out of a long, collective breath. People began walking their dogs again without glancing over their shoulders. The constant tension that had settled over Briarwood Pines had lifted, replaced by cautious optimism, and a few hesitant waves between neighbors who, until recently, barely made eye contact. I was out back replacing a fence panel Diesel had worn down with his patrol rounds when I saw a U-Haul backing into the driveway 2 doors down. It was Deborah's former house. The blinds had been closed since the morning she was taken into custody, and now movers were hauling out furniture wrapped in plastic. A lean man in a canvas jacket stood at the edge of the truck, clipboard in hand. He didn't look like a family member, more like a court appointee. I didn't linger. I had no interest in whatever remained of her legacy. That afternoon, I got a call from Natalie Ruiz. She'd been promoted to interim HOA ombudsman by the county. Her voice was brisk but not unfriendly. "There's something you should see," she said. "It relates to a matter still unfolding." I met her at a downtown office building, 10 stories up in a glass-paneled conference room with an uninterrupted view of the city skyline. She wasn't alone. A man in a gray suit with an FBI badge clipped to his belt stood beside her, arms folded. He introduced himself as Agent Bellamy. No handshake, just a nod, and a folder slid across the table. Inside were photographs. Grainy, time-stamped images from a trail cam mounted in the woods behind my property. I hadn't set it up, neither had the HOA. "These were recovered from a private investigator's hard drive," Agent Bellamy said. "He was contracted by a third party to gather leverage on resistant homeowners." I flipped through the images. Most were uneventful backyards, trash bins, the occasional raccoon. Then I found it. A photo of me unloading tools from my garage, the timestamp matching the night before I'd confronted Randall at the back fence. "This was taken without a warrant," I said. "Correct," the agent replied. "We're building a case for criminal stalking, unlawful surveillance, and several counts of data privacy violations." Natalie leaned forward. "We believe Sapphire Ridge sent agents to monitor specific homeowners, not digitally, physically." I stared at the image. "And you're just telling me this now?" "We needed the chain of evidence," Bellamy said. "The investigator cut a deal to avoid obstruction charges. That's how we got these." Natalie handed me another document, a deposition transcript. In it, Randall admitted to authorizing off-record payments to Sapphire Ridge to keep certain households cooperative. He mentioned my name twice. "That's not all," she continued. "The zoning application, it wasn't just about commercial development. They were negotiating with a third-tier holding firm to build a private access road that would have bypassed county codes by claiming it as an emergency service path." Bellamy added, "Essentially, they were trying to create a gated enclave within an existing neighborhood. One they could control through deed restrictions and private security." I sat back in the chair. "They were building a kingdom," Natalie nodded, "and you were in the way." By the end of the meeting, I'd signed a witness statement and agreed to testify if the case went federal. The FBI was looking at broader connections, similar incidents in 2 other counties, all involving shell HOAs, development scams, and surveillance for hire outfits operating just outside the law. Back in Briarwood, the neighborhood was organizing its first truly democratic HOA election. Not a rubber stamp vote, but a real campaign with candidates, flyers, and open forums. I didn't run, but I agreed to moderate one of the debates, mostly to make sure no one tried to sneak in a community harmony initiative under a new name. The night of the forum, the community center was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls, and someone brought a portable speaker system. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. The candidates answered questions about transparency, budgeting, and how to prevent abuses of power without turning the HOA into a toothless social club. One woman, a postal worker named Marlene, got a standing ovation when she said, "If someone wants to start a neighborhood watch, great. But if they start talking about installing cameras that point into backyards, I'll personally cut the wires." The crowd laughed, but there was truth in the tension. After the forum, a man in his 60s approached me. He introduced himself as Victor, a former city contractor who'd lived on the edge of the loop for a decade. He handed me a photograph, a faded aerial shot of the neighborhood from 15 years ago. "That easement behind your house," he said. "It used to be the only access point for emergency crews when the main road flooded. It's on the county's disaster response map. Still is." I studied the image. Sure enough, a dashed line ran along the gravel lane, marked as an alternate ingress route. "That road doesn't just belong to you," he said. "It belongs to every person who might need an ambulance when the main road's blocked." So that was it. Deborah wasn't just trying to remove a gate. She was trying to erase a public safety route for the sake of her private empire. 2 weeks later, the results of the election came in. Marlene won by a landslide. So did Tom and a high school civics teacher named Priya, who promised to post every meeting agenda online and live stream the sessions for transparency. The county lifted the HOA suspension with conditions: mandatory third-party audits, quarterly town halls, and a 2-year probationary period under external review. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for the criminal case, charges were finalized. Deborah faced counts of wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and violation of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Randall's plea deal reduced his sentence, but he forfeited his home, pension, and any future role in community governance. The developer posing as Greg Vance was still missing, but the FBI had issued a federal warrant for identity fraud. I received a formal letter of thanks from the county and a separate one from the district attorney's office commending my persistence under duress. I pinned it to the inside of the garage, right above Diesel's bed. One quiet morning, I rebuilt the back gate. Not because it had been damaged, but because I wanted it stronger. Reinforced hinges, weather-sealed locks, and a motion sensor that triggered a light and a quiet chime inside the house. Not out of fear, just awareness. I added a small sign: "Emergency access lane, do not block." A few days later, I noticed someone had placed a bouquet of wildflowers beside the post. No note, just a silent thank you, maybe from someone who'd been watching all along. The neighborhood changed after that. Not overnight and not without friction, but people talked more. They listened. The kind of petty complaints that used to clog meetings: garden gnomes, fence colors, trash bins left out too long, faded into the background. They were replaced with real concerns: drainage, school zoning, elderly residents needing mobility ramps. Things that mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I caught sight of Diesel standing at the edge of the yard, ears perked. A kid rode by on a bike, waved at him, and kept going. Diesel wagged once and turned back toward the porch. That night, I sat out back with a cup of coffee, watching the wind stir the trees beyond the fence. The gravel lane stretched quiet and undisturbed, just as it always should have been. No more cars blocking the gate, no more clipboards, no more kingdoms disguised as neighborhoods, just home. And the people who finally remembered how to protect it.